An elderly beggar woman saw that they couldn't save the millionaire until the ambulance arrived. Minutes later, everyone knelt down when they saw what she did. The midday sun ruthlessly punished the financial center of the city, transforming the mirrored glass towers into vertical furnaces that reflected light and heat in all directions. William Harrison crossed through the revolving doors of the most imposing corporate building in that concrete and steel jungle, his face red with anger as his Italian shoes echoed on the polished marble of the lobby. He pressed the cell phone against his ear with such force that his fingers turned white, and his voice reverberated through the vast space, frightening receptionists and visitors waiting for the elevators. Every word that left his mouth was loaded with venom and frustration, and he gesticulated violently with his free hand as he walked toward the exit, completely ignoring the frightened looks around him. The building's air conditioning had temporarily masked the infernal heat that awaited him outside, but William was so absorbed in his call that he didn't even notice the abrupt change in temperature when he stepped onto the busy sidewalk. 15 million! You lost 15 million in one morning! He shouted into the phone, his voice cutting through the traffic noise like a sharp blade. The sidewalk was crowded with hurried executives walking in all directions, avoiding each other in an urban dance rehearsed by daily routine. In the same corner as always, leaning against the building wall where the shadow offered some relief from the scorching sun, Donna Margaret observed the movement with her tired but attentive eyes. Her worn and faded clothes contrasted drastically with the expensive suits that passed by her like blurs, and her crumpled cardboard displayed in trembling letters the message she renewed every week with a piece of charcoal. Any help, God blesses. She had been there for so long that she had become part of the urban landscape, invisible like trash cans or lampposts, noticed only when someone needed to avoid her. Her grey hair was tied in a loose bun, and her calloused hands held a dented metal mug where a few coins she had collected that morning clinked. The heat made her back hurt more than usual, and she slowly changed position, feeling every muscle protest after hours sitting in the same place. "Today is hotter than yesterday," she muttered to herself, wiping the sweat from her forehead with the back of her calloused hand. William continued his furious march along the sidewalk, completely oblivious to the world around him, as he shouted instructions and threats to whoever was on the other end of the phone line. His three-piece suit, which had cost more than many people earned in a year, was already beginning to show sweat stains in the armpits and back, but he didn't care about that now. All that mattered were the millions lost, the contracts that would need to be revised, the heads that would roll for this monumental incompetence his subordinates had committed. He passed a street vendor, almost knocking over his stand of counterfeit glasses, but didn't even look back when the man shouted in protest. Donna Margaret saw William approaching like an enraged bull, and by instinct developed over years on the streets, tried to stand up to ask for some coins. It was an automatic movement, almost involuntary, born from the need to take advantage of every opportunity, even knowing that men like him rarely stopped or even noticed her. She took 2 staggering steps toward the sidewalk, extending her mug in a silent plea she had made thousands of times. "Please, sir, any help," she said in a hoarse voice, but her words were lost in the deafening noise of the city. They collided abruptly, and the elderly woman lost her balance, falling onto the hot sidewalk. Despite the pain, she tried to compose herself and continue. The mug flew from her hands, spinning in the air before hitting the ground with a metallic crash that echoed along the sidewalk, scattering the few coins it contained in all directions. The coins rolled across the sidewalk like small golden suns, some falling into the cracks between the cobblestones, others rolling into the gutter, and each one represented hours of waiting and humiliation under the caustic sun. William didn't even slow down, just adjusted his shoulder as if he had bumped into an inconvenient post and continued walking, still shouting into the phone about incompetence and lawsuits to come. It doesn't matter. I've been through worse," she whispered to herself, tears threatening to fall as she felt the hot ground in search of every penny. But then something changed in the air, as if the universe itself had decided to intervene in that moment of everyday injustice that was repeated thousands of times a day in that indifferent city. William stopped abruptly in the middle of the sidewalk, his entire body becoming rigid, as if he had been struck by an invisible lightning bolt that paralyzed every muscle. The phone slipped from his suddenly weak fingers, and the expensive device shattered on the ground, the screen fragmenting into 1,000 pieces that shimmered under the sun like broken diamonds scattered on the asphalt. His right hand went straight to his chest, clutching the fine fabric of his Italian shirt, as if he could tear out the sudden pain exploding inside. A pain that seemed to rip his chest from the inside out, with invisible claws. His face, which seconds before was red with anger and indignation, turned as pale as paper, and drops of cold sweat began to form on his forehead, despite the infernal midday heat that made the asphalt smolder. William's knees gave way, as if someone had cut invisible strings that kept him standing, and he collapsed heavily on the sidewalk, his body hitting the hot concrete with a dull thud that made several people around turn to look with morbid curiosity. "What is happening to me?" he gasped, but the words came out as a hoarse whisper that nobody could hear. The first to react was one of the building's security guards, a tall, muscular man, who was standing at the entrance observing the street movement when he saw William fall. He ran toward the fallen millionaire, his navy blue uniform standing out among the grey and black suits of the executives who were beginning to gather around the scene. The security guard knelt beside William, his large calloused hands clumsily checking the pulse in the man's neck, looking for vital signs that would confirm he was still alive. Another security guard appeared seconds later, already with his cell phone in hand, frantically dialing the emergency number while shouting for onlookers to step back and give the man space to breathe. The crowd, however, did exactly the opposite, moving closer and closer, forming a tight circle around the unfolding drama, each person with their phone raised, filming someone else's suffering as if it were entertainment. "Call an ambulance, quick!" "It's Mr. Harrison," shouted the first security guard, his voice laden with panic as he recognized who the fallen man was. A young executive, who appeared to be no more than 30 and wore a suit that was clearly his best piece of clothing, pushed past some onlookers and knelt on the other side of William. He had taken a first aid course 5 years earlier, when he was still an intern, and the company required all new employees to undergo basic emergency training. His hands visibly trembled as he tried to remember the procedures, his mind scrambling the instructions while panic took over his thoughts. He positioned his fingers on William's wrist, searching for the carotid artery as he had learned, but his sweaty hands slipped on the millionaire's moist skin, and he couldn't be sure if he felt anything or if it was just his own accelerated pulse. Sweat ran down his young face, dripping onto William's expensive suit as he desperately tried to do something useful, anything that might help. "I think he still has a pulse, but it's very weak," he said, his voice trembling as much as his hands as he looked at the security guard for confirmation. William's breathing was becoming increasingly labored, each inhalation a Herculean effort that made his chest rise and fall irregularly, as if he were drowning in solid air. His eyes, wide with terror, stared fixedly at the cloudless sky, but it was obvious that he wasn't really seeing anything, lost somewhere between consciousness and unconsciousness. The lips that before shouted orders and threats were now beginning to take on a worrying bluish tinge, a clear sign that oxygen wasn't reaching where it needed to go. The heat from the asphalt penetrated the thin fabric of his suit, burning his back, but William showed no sign of feeling anything beyond the crushing pain in his chest that seemed to be compressed by an invisible press. People around began to shout contradictory suggestions, each thinking they knew what to do better than the others, creating a cacophony of voices that only increased the chaos and confusion. "Raise his legs!" someone shouted, while another protested, saying that was for fainting, not for heart attacks. Margaret remained kneeling on the hot ground, but had stopped collecting the coins, her attention completely focused on the scene unfolding a few meters from her. Her experienced eyes, which had seen many things during the difficult years on the streets and before that, analyzed every detail with a precision that contrasted with her disheveled appearance. She observed the way William's chest rose and fell, the tone of his skin, the position of his body, and something inside her, something that had been buried beneath layers of despair and resignation, began to awaken. It was as if a dormant part of her mind was being activated, recognizing signs and symptoms that she knew as well as her own name. She saw the young executive trying to check the pulse in the wrong place, the security guard shouting confused information on the phone, the crowd stealing the precious oxygen that William needed, and knew that if nothing changed quickly, That man would die right there. "They're doing everything wrong," she murmured to herself, her voice too low for anyone to hear amid the chaos. William's driver, who had been waiting patiently in the limousine parked a few meters away, finally noticed the commotion and recognized his boss at the center of the tumult. He ran out of the car, leaving the door open and the engine running, and rushed to the group of people clustered around William. The man, wearing an impeccable uniform despite the suffocating heat, carried the company cell phone in one hand and the car keys in the other, not knowing exactly what to do with either. When he saw the state of his boss, his face lost all color, and he almost dropped the phone from his suddenly weak hands. He had worked for William for more than 10 years, knew his routine, his habits, his emergency numbers, and now needed to make a decision that could change everything. "I need to notify his wife," he said to himself, already dialing the number he knew by heart. While the driver was frantically speaking on the phone, trying to explain the situation to William's personal secretary, who had answered the call, more people continued to arrive and crowd around the scene. Some were building employees who had come down to see what was happening. Others were passers-by who simply couldn't resist the human drama unfolding on the sidewalk. The circle of onlookers now had 3 or 4 rows of depth, with people on tiptoes trying to see over the shoulders of those in front, their cell phones raised like modern periscopes, capturing every second of the tragedy. The air was becoming increasingly stifling and unbreathable at the center of the group, the heat from the packed bodies adding to the merciless midday sun. "Give him space to breathe," shouted the security guard for the 5th time, but his voice was lost in the growing murmur of excited and concerned voices. The young executive had begun doing chest compressions on William, but it was evident that he didn't know exactly what he was doing, his hands positioned too high on the chest, almost at the shoulders, and his compressions were superficial and irregular. He was clearly exhausted after just a minute, sweat running down his face and soaking his shirt, but he continued trying because no one else seemed to know what to do. Between compressions, he looked around desperately, searching for someone who could take control, someone who really knew what to do in such a situation. The security guard on the phone continued shouting the address to the emergency operator, repeating the same information several times as if this would make the ambulance arrive faster through the congested traffic. "It's a cardiac emergency." "The man is dying here," he shouted into the phone, his voice hoarse from so much talking. William had completely stopped responding, and in that terrible moment, everyone around understood that a man of just 52 was on the verge of losing everything he had built in decades of tireless work. Time seemed to have stopped, but in reality it was running against him. Each second without oxygen meant the risk of never again being able to lead his company, never making important decisions again, never recognizing the faces of his 3 children who were still in university and depended on him for everything. Someone in the crowd mentioned that William had just closed the biggest deal of his career the week before, a merger that would create jobs for thousands of people, and now all of this could be left without leadership, without direction, like a ship without a captain in the midst of a storm. The young executive trying to help recognized William from business magazine covers. He was the man who had built an empire from nothing, who had started selling products door to door at 18 and now commanded one of the largest corporations in the country. All this story of overcoming, all these years of sacrifice and dedication could end there on that dirty sidewalk before he could see his youngest daughter graduate from medical school next year. "That's William Harrison, the owner of Harrison Enterprises," someone whispered in the crowd, and a collective shiver passed through the group as they realized who was lying there. The silence surrounding him was the silence of a lifetime of achievements hanging by a thread, of unfulfilled promises, of words never spoken to his family, of apologies that would never be made. There were rumors that William was about to expand his business abroad, that he had meetings scheduled with international investors next week, contracts worth billions that might now never be signed. His eldest son had just joined the company as a trainee, dreaming of one day working alongside his father, learning his secrets to success, continuing the family legacy, a dream that could die there on that hot Tuesday afternoon. The driver, still on the phone, mentioned to someone that William had a crucial meeting at 3 o'clock with the board of directors, where he would present the restructuring plan that would save 200 jobs at risk. People with families, with bills to pay, with children in school, who could now lose everything because the man who fought for them was losing his own battle. The security guard recalled aloud that he had seen William arrive every morning at 6 o'clock sharp for 10 years, always the first to arrive and the last to leave, dedicating his life to that company that could now be left orphaned. "He's only 52, too young for this," a lady in the crowd murmured, thinking of her own husband of the same age. The implications of what was happening were becoming clear to everyone present. It wasn't just one life at stake, it was thousands of interconnected lives that depended on that man in some way. William had a wife waiting for him for their anniversary dinner that night, 25 years together, that he had promised to celebrate in grand style, with the vow renewal they had planned for months. His elderly parents, who lived in a luxury nursing home paid for by him, wouldn't understand why their son had stopped visiting them every Sunday as he had religiously done for years. The charitable foundation that William had created in memory of his deceased sister, which provided scholarships for underprivileged youth, would lose its main supporter and visionary, cutting off the dreams of hundreds of students who depended on that help. The Downtown Revitalization Project, of which William was the main investor, and which promised to transform degraded areas into spaces for coexistence and commerce, generating jobs and improving the lives of thousands of people, could die with him. Even the children's football team he sponsored in the poor neighborhood where he grew up would lose not just the sponsorship, but the man who showed up at every game to encourage the children, telling them they could be whatever they wanted if they worked hard. "The company has 3,000 employees," someone said, and the weight of that number hung over the crowd like a dark cloud. The young executive paused his attempts to help for a moment, his hands trembling, not just from physical exertion, but from understanding the magnitude of what was happening there. He had joined William's company just 2 years ago, freshly graduated and full of dreams, and William himself had been his mentor, teaching him not just about business, but about ethics, about responsibility, about how true success is measured by the good you do for others. Now this mentor, this example, this man who seemed invincible in his board meetings, was completely vulnerable, and with him all the lessons he still had to teach, all the advice he still had to give. The executive remembered that William had mentioned the previous week that he was writing a book about his business journey, a work that would inspire future generations of entrepreneurs, and that now might remain forever unfinished, like a symphony interrupted in the middle of its most important movement. There was also the trainee program that William had created, giving opportunities to young people from poor families, as he himself had once been. A program that, without his leadership and vision, could be cut by the board in the next restructuring. Suddenly, William stopped responding, and desperation took over the people around him, who were trying to stay calm and help him until help arrived. The situation had reached a critical point, with each passing second reducing William's chances of surviving without serious sequelae. The clock in the nearby bank tower marked that 4 minutes had passed since the initial collapse, 4 minutes that seemed like an eternity to everyone involved. The security guard on the phone was almost screaming now, begging for the ambulance to find a way through traffic, informing that the victim had stopped breathing and they needed help immediately. Several people in the crowd began praying quietly, some kneeling, others with hands clasped together, as if their prayers could somehow bring William back. The young executive resumed compressions, but now his hands were shaking so much he could barely maintain the rhythm, and it was obvious he was on the verge of physical and emotional collapse. "Does anyone else know how to do this? Please," he begged, looking at the faces around him. Mrs. Margaret watched everything with growing frustration, seeing the mistakes accumulating, precious time being wasted, life draining from the man who had knocked her down minutes earlier. Part of her whispered that it was poetic justice, that this arrogant man who hadn't even stopped to apologize was getting what he deserved. But another part, a deeper and more fundamental part of who she was, or at least who she had been, couldn't simply watch someone die when she knew she could do something. She rose slowly, her joints protesting, and took a hesitant step toward the group, then another, each movement a battle between the survival instinct that kept her invisible and the oath she had taken decades ago. "I could help," she said softly, but no one heard her amid the chaos, The passerby who had taken over the cardiac compressions was completely exhausted, his clothes soaked with sweat as if he had run a marathon under the scorching sun. His compressions had become increasingly weak and spaced out, and it was evident he couldn't continue for much longer. He stopped again, checking William's pulse with trembling fingers, desperately searching for any sign of life in the motionless body. His fingers pressed against the millionaire's neck in various places, trying to find the carotid artery, but he couldn't feel anything beyond his own accelerated pulse echoing in his ears. He looked at the security guard, then at the young executive, his eyes reflecting the desperation everyone felt at that moment. The ambulance siren could be heard in the distance, but it seemed to be stuck somewhere in the labyrinth of congested streets downtown. "He's not responding. We need a miracle. Where is that ambulance?" he said, shaking his head in defeat as he moved away from William's body. The sound of very high heels clicking against the concrete cut through the murmur of the crowd like a machine gun, firing at a frantic rhythm, and everyone turned to see an elegant woman running desperately toward the huddled group. Catherine Harrison had just come down from the 30th floor of the building, where she had gone to meet her husband for the lunch they had scheduled weeks ago, only to discover from the driver's hysterical call that William was lying on the sidewalk, fighting between life and death. Her designer dress, which had cost more than many people earned in months, was already wrinkled from running, and her perfectly applied makeup was beginning to smear with tears that were already flowing before she even reached her husband. She violently pushed people out of her way, her expensive purse swinging uncontrollably as she forced her way through the crowd like a force of nature, ignoring the protests and complaints of those who were thrown aside. When she finally saw William motionless on the ground, with the exhausted passerby moving away from him in defeat, something inside her broke in a way that everyone could hear, even without sound. "William, my God, William, don't do this to me," she screamed, her voice echoing off the surrounding buildings like a lament that made even the most hardened feel a tightness in their hearts. Catherine fell to her knees beside her husband with such force that the impact must have hurt, but she didn't seem to notice, her hands shaking violently as she touched his face, looking for some sign of recognition in those eyes that always looked at her with such intensity. The tears fell like rain on William's motionless face, completely smearing the expensive makeup she had applied so carefully that morning, transforming her perfectly made-up face into a smudged mask of despair and mascara. She grabbed his hand, pressing it against her chest as if she could transfer her own life to him through touch, as if the love she felt was strong enough to bring him back from the precipice where he was teetering. Her sobs were so deep, they seemed to come from her very soul, and she rocked back and forth holding her husband, murmuring promises and pleas that blended into an incomprehensible litany of pain. The contrast between the elegant woman she had been minutes ago and the desperate wife she was now was shocking, showing how tragedy can destroy all social masks in seconds. "Please, my love, come back to me. Our children need you. I need you," she begged, her voice breaking on every word. While Catherine leaned over her husband, another well-dressed man appeared running through the main entrance of the building, his cell phone glued to his ear while gesticulating frantically with his free hand. David Mitchell had been William's partner for more than 15 years. They had built their business empire together since the days when they shared a tiny room in the cheapest shopping center in town. Now seeing his partner and friend fallen on the ground, he entered a frenzied action mode that was his standard response to any crisis, throwing money at the problem until it disappeared. He was already screaming into the phone at his personal assistant, ordering them to contact all the private doctors in the city, all cardiac specialists, anyone who could arrive before the ambulance that was still stuck somewhere in the hellish traffic. His normally composed face was red from the effort of shouting, and veins bulged in his neck as he increased the offers with each refusal he received from the other end of the line. 100,000, 200,000, $500,000 for the doctor who gets here in 5 minutes, he shouted into the phone, his wild eyes sweeping through the crowd as if he could materialize a doctor through sheer willpower. David knelt on the other side of William, opposite Catherine, and for the first time in years that powerful man who commanded board meetings with an iron fist looked completely lost and helpless. He looked at the motionless face of his friend and partner, remembering all the business battles they had fought together, all the victories they had celebrated, all the plans they still had for the future. And the reality that all of this could end right there on that dirty sidewalk hit him like a punch to the stomach. His hands, which signed million-dollar contracts without trembling, now shook uncontrollably as he tried to help in some way, anyway, but didn't know what to do besides offering money that at that moment was worth nothing. The man who always had a solution for everything, who navigated the business world like a shark in water, was now reduced to a desperate friend, helplessly watching as life escaped from someone he loved like a brother. "I'll pay whatever it takes." "It's William Harrison, for God's sake. Some doctor has to come here and do something," he shouted to the crowd, his voice breaking with desperation. It was at that moment that a man in a white coat appeared running from the pharmacy across the street, carrying a medical bag that swung uncontrollably as he tried to make his way through the increasingly dense crowd. The pharmacist, a middle-aged gentleman with graying hair and reading glasses hanging from his neck, had seen the commotion from the window of his establishment and decided to bring the emergency kit he kept for extreme situations. He knelt beside William with surprising agility for his age, already opening the bag and frantically searching for the equipment he needed, his hands experienced but clearly nervous with the pressure of the situation. Inside the bag was a small portable defibrillator, one of those that the City Hall had distributed to commercial establishments a few years ago, but that few really knew how to use, and he took it out carefully, trying to remember the basic training he had received. The device seemed more complicated than he remembered, with wires and electrodes that needed to be positioned in specific places, and his hands began to tremble as he tried to unravel the cables that seemed to have tangled themselves inside the bag. "Everyone step back. I need space to work with the defibrillator," he shouted, trying to sound more confident than he actually was. The pharmacist turned on the device and waited for the green light to indicate it was ready for use, but nothing happened. The screen remained dark, as if mocking his desperate efforts. He pressed the button again, then once more, each attempt more frantic than the previous one, until he finally turned the device over and saw the battery indicator completely empty, probably discharged for months without anyone noticing. The horror on his face was visible to everyone around when he realized that the equipment that could save William's life was completely useless, a dead weight of plastic and metal that served no purpose other than to give false hope. He looked around desperately, as if he might find an outlet in the middle of the sidewalk or a generator hidden somewhere, but he knew it was useless, that he had wasted precious seconds with equipment that would never work. Frustration and a sense of helplessness completely overwhelmed him, and he threw the defibrillator on the ground with force, the device bouncing off the concrete with a hollow noise that seemed to echo the emptiness everyone felt. "The battery is dead. This useless equipment has no battery," he shouted, tears of frustration beginning to form in his eyes. At that moment, a uniformed police officer finally arrived at the scene, pushing people aside with authority while trying to establish some order in the chaos that had settled in. He was a young man, probably in his late 20s, and although he tried to appear calm and in control, it was evident from the sweat on his forehead and the tremor in his voice that he too was overwhelmed by the situation. He began pushing onlookers back, creating a perimeter around William, and those trying to help him shouting orders for people to stop filming and give space for air to circulate. But it was like trying to hold back the ocean with his hands. For every person he pushed away, 2 new ones appeared, their cell phones raised like modern totems capturing every second of the human drama unfolding. The officer tried to organize the scene, asking someone to bring water, another to provide shade, a third to continue resuscitation attempts, but his orders were lost in the general chaos, each person doing what they thought best without any coordination. "Stop filming and help or get out of here. This man needs space to breathe," he shouted, but his young voice lacked the necessary authority to control the crowd. The situation was rapidly deteriorating, with more and more people crowding around, making the air even more unbreathable and stifling at the center of the human circle. Someone had brought a bottle of water and was pouring the liquid on William's face, thinking it might help him wake up, without realizing it could be making any breathing attempts even more difficult. Another well-intentioned person had improvised shade with a newspaper, but was positioned in such a way that blocked access to anyone who wanted to try more chest compressions. The cacophony of voices, contradictory orders, cries and shouts created an atmosphere of panic that made it impossible to think clearly or act efficiently. Catherine remained clutching her husband, sobbing uncontrollably, while David shouted increasingly louder into the phone, raising his offers to astronomical sums that meant nothing in the face of the moment's helplessness. The pharmacist was now trying manual chest compressions, but it was obvious he lacked proper training, his hands incorrectly positioned and his compressions too superficial to make any difference. "Does anyone know how to do this right? Please, someone who knows what they're doing," the officer pleaded, looking desperately at the crowd. It was then that Donna Margaret, who had observed everything from her peripheral position, decided she could no longer stand by watching while a man died due to widespread incompetence and panic. She stood up with difficulty, leaning on her improvised cane made from a broomstick she had found in the trash weeks ago, and began limping toward the center of the commotion. Each step was painful for her joints worn down by years of life on the streets, but there was a determination in her eyes that wasn't there minutes before, as if something dormant inside her had finally awakened in the face of the urgency of the situation. Her ragged and dirty appearance contrasted absurdly with the expensive clothes of the people around her, and many looked at her with disdain or disgust as she passed, as if her poverty were contagious. She tried to pass through the first cordon of people, muttering requests to be let through that no one heard or chose to ignore, until she finally reached where the security guards had formed a human barrier around William. "Excuse me, I need to pass, I can help," she said in a low but firm voice, trying to squeeze between two burly security guards. The security guards noticed her immediately, and the larger of them, a man who seemed to have been carved from granite, with arms that tested the limits of his uniform, immediately extended his arm to block her. He looked her up and down with a disdain he didn't try to hide, seeing only another beggar trying to take advantage of the situation to ask for money or cause problems. His enormous hand gripped her fragile arm with more force than necessary, and he pushed her back unceremoniously, as if shoving away an inconvenient animal. The other security guard joined the first, forming an impenetrable wall between her and the dying man, their faces making it clear that she wasn't welcome there, that her presence was an offense to the gravity of the situation. The irony of protecting a dying man from someone who could save him would be comical if it weren't tragic, but they couldn't know that. They only saw the surface, the appearance, the prejudices that years of social conditioning had created. "Ma'am, please, step back. This is a medical emergency. This is no place for begging," said the larger security guard, his voice loaded with irritation. Donna Margaret tried to balance herself when she was pushed, her improvised cane slipping on the smooth sidewalk, and for a moment it seemed she would fall, but she managed to stabilize herself at the last second. She looked at the security guards with a mixture of frustration and urgency, knowing that each second lost decreased William's chances of survival, but also knowing that her appearance worked against her, that nobody would believe that a dirty, poorly dressed beggar could have anything useful to offer. She tried to speak again, to raise her voice above the chaos around her, but her dry, hoarse throat from years of deprivation could barely produce more than a whisper. Time was running out. She could see it in the color William's face was turning, in the way his body was completely motionless, in the desperate but useless way people around were trying to help without knowing what to do. Years of medical training, decades of experience saving lives, all of this was trapped inside her, prevented from being used because of appearances, prejudices, and the cruel irony that those who most needed help were often the last to be heard. "I am a doctor, I can save him." She tried once more, but her voice was lost in the noise around. The smaller security guard, a younger man who seemed to be in his first year on the job, immediately joined his more experienced colleague to form an even stronger barrier against the filthy beggar who dared to approach. The two men positioned themselves shoulder to shoulder, their blue uniforms forming an insurmountable wall between Donna Margaret and the fallen millionaire, and both looked at her with the same disdain and repulsion they reserved for all beggars who tried to approach the building. The idea of a ragged, homeless woman being a doctor was so absurd it didn't even merit consideration, and they treated her claim with the contempt they thought it deserved. Meanwhile, the scene around William was becoming increasingly chaotic, with Catherine now almost hysterical, shaking her husband and begging him to wake up. David offering increasingly absurd sums on the phone, and the pharmacist clearly exhausted from his poorly executed resuscitation attempts. The young police officer was completely overwhelmed, trying to coordinate efforts that were uncoordinatable, give orders that nobody followed, maintain an order that had been lost from the beginning. He needs professional help. "Where is that damn ambulance?" shouted David, looking desperately at the street as if he could materialize the emergency vehicle. The larger security guard exploded in cruel laughter upon hearing Donna Margaret insist she was a doctor, a mocking laugh that was immediately joined by his colleague and by several people in the crowd who found the idea completely ridiculous. He pointed at her with disdain, drawing everyone's attention to her deplorable appearance, the torn and dirty clothes, the sour smell of someone who hadn't bathed in days, the barefoot and cracked feet, the tangled hair full of street dirt. The very idea of someone in that state having any type of higher education was so absurd that it seemed like a tasteless joke in such a grave moment. The security guard turned to the crowd, gesturing broadly as if he were presenting a circus show, his voice loaded with sarcasm and cruelty as he exposed the beggar to public ridicule. Others in the crowd began to laugh too, some pointing at her, others shaking their heads in disbelief that she had the audacity to make such a claim in such a serious moment. "A doctor? This filthy beggar! Go back to your cardboard, woman. Stop bothering people who are really trying to help," he shouted, his voice echoing down the street. The younger security guard laughed along with his partner, finding the absurd situation of a beggar pretending to be a doctor genuinely funny, and took a step forward to reinforce the barrier against her. Several people in the crowd began to boo and tell Donna Margaret to leave, irritated that she was trying to draw attention to herself at such a critical moment with her delusional fantasies. A well-dressed woman commented loudly that it was typical of beggars to try to take advantage of any situation to get money or attention, and that it was shameful she was lying blatantly while a man was dying. The police officer also looked at Donna Margaret with irritation, thinking she was just creating more confusion in an already chaotic situation, and gestured for the security guards to remove her immediately. The pharmacist, exhausted and frustrated with his own failure, also shouted for her to leave, saying it wasn't time for jokes or delusions from street people. The humiliation was complete and devastating, with dozens of people laughing, pointing and shouting for her to leave, nobody taking her claim to be a doctor seriously. "Get out of here before we call the police to drag you away, lying beggar!" someone in the crowd shouted. The ambulance siren was still audible in the distance, but it didn't seem to be getting any closer, stuck in some insurmountable traffic jam, or lost in the labyrinthine streets of downtown. The sound, which should bring hope, had become torture, a constant reminder that help was so close and at the same time so impossibly far away. Each passing second was a second stolen from William's chances, and everyone there knew it, the weight of this knowledge making the atmosphere even more suffocating than the midday heat. The pharmacist had completely stopped his attempts, sitting on his heels with an expression of absolute defeat, his hands trembling no longer from effort, but from the weight of failure. Catherine had stopped screaming and now just cried silently, hugging her husband's body, as if she could prevent his soul from departing through the strength of her embrace. David had dropped the phone, finally realizing that all the money in the world couldn't buy the minutes that William needed. "He's not breathing anymore. He hasn't been breathing for minutes," said the pharmacist, his voice barely audible. It was at this critical moment that Donna Margaret made a decision that would change everything, pushing the security guards with a surprising strength born of desperation and the certainty that she was the only person there who could make a difference. She passed through them before they could react, dropping her cane and practically throwing herself on her knees beside William, her hands immediately going to his neck to check for the pulse she knew she wouldn't find. Her experienced fingers, despite being dirty and calloused, found exactly the right spot, and the confirmation of what she suspected made her act with a speed that contradicted her age and physical condition. She looked around quickly, assessing the situation, seeing all the mistakes that had been made, all the time wasted, and knew she would have to act fast and with precision if she wanted to have any chance. The security guards began to move toward her, ready to remove her from there, but something in the way she positioned herself, in the confidence of her movements, made them hesitate for a crucial moment. You can laugh and ridicule me all you want. I don't care about you, I can save him. I'm a doctor, graduated and specialized in emergencies whether you believe it or not, she shouted with a voice that suddenly had authority, cutting through the chaos like a scalpel. Donna Margaret completely ignored the laughter and insults that still echoed around her, focusing all her attention on the dying man in front of her with the intensity of a surgeon entering his operating room. Her hands, which seemed fragile and shaky when picking up coins, suddenly moved with a precision that completely contradicted her decrepit appearance, positioning themselves exactly on the correct point of William's sternum. She interlaced her fingers, locked her elbows, and began compressions with a strength that no one would expect from an elderly and apparently debilitated woman, each movement calculated to compress the heart exactly to the right extent, neither too superficial to be useless nor too deep to cause damage. The silence that took over the nearest group was almost instantaneous when they saw the perfect technique, the precise rhythm, the professional posture that was impossible to fake or improvise. The security guards who had moved to drag her away stopped mid-movement, their brains struggling to process the dissonance between what they were seeing and what they expected to see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, she counted out loud, her voice firm and clear, cutting through the chaos around her. Upon reaching the 30th compression, Donna Margaret stopped and with quick and efficient movements, tilted William's head back at the exact angle to open his airways, using one hand to elevate his chin while the other pinched his nostrils. Without hesitation, she lowered her mouth over his and blew twice, filling his lungs with the air he desperately needed, completely ignoring the shock and repulsion visible on the faces around her. The contrast was surreal. A dirty, foul-smelling beggar performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on one of the richest and most powerful men in the city, breaking all imaginable social barriers in the name of preserving life. Catherine let out a strangled cry at the sight, part of her wanting to push the beggar away, another part recognizing that something different was happening, that these movements were not those of an amateur. David had stopped shouting into the phone, watching open-mouthed, as Donna Margaret returned to the compressions with the same methodical precision, her hands finding the exact same spot without even needing to look. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, she continued counting, each number pronounced with the calmness of someone who has done this hundreds of times. The pharmacist, who had given up minutes before, crawled closer, his eyes wide with astonishment as he recognized the perfect cardiopulmonary resuscitation technique being executed. He had taken courses, had practiced on dummies, but had never seen anyone perform the procedure with such precision and confidence in a real situation, especially someone who looked like they had just walked out of a homeless shelter. Donna Margaret's compressions were deep enough to compress the heart, but not break ribs, rhythmic like a metronome positioned exactly where they should be to maximize blood flow to the brain. Between compressions, she spoke to William as if he could hear her, her voice taking on a professional tone that was completely different from the hoarse beggar's whisper everyone had heard before. The young police officer had stopped trying to organize the crowd, hypnotized by the transformation he was witnessing, seeing that despised woman become something completely different before his eyes. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, the counting continued relentlessly, each compression an attempt to force the stopped heart to beat again. Everyone step back. He needs air. You're consuming the oxygen, Donna Margaret ordered, with an authority that instinctively made everyone take a step back, creating a larger circle around her and William. Even the security guards who seconds before had ridiculed her now obeyed without question, something in her voice and posture commanding respect despite her appearance. She continued the cycle with chronometric precision, 30 compressions, 2 breaths, quick pulse check, and back to compressions. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of decades of practice, each movement so deeply engraved in her being that she didn't even need to think. Her body simply knew what to do. Between the series of compressions, she murmured medical information that only a professional would know, calculating aloud the time of cardiac arrest, the chances of recovery, the risks of brain damage. The crowd had gone completely silent. Even those who were filming had lowered their phones, all observing in a mixture of amazement and disbelief. 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, she continued, sweat beginning to drip down her dirty forehead. Catherine, still kneeling beside her husband, observed each of Donna Margaret's movements with wide eyes, tears still flowing but now mixed with a desperate hope that wasn't there before. She could see that this was different, that this strange, dirty woman knew exactly what she was doing, that her movements had a precision and purpose that the pharmacist and the young executive had not demonstrated. Her hands trembled in the air, wanting to help but not knowing how, wanting to touch her husband, but afraid of disrupting whatever this mysterious beggar was doing. David also watched in silence, his phone forgotten in his hand, his business brain trying to process how a beggar could possess such obviously advanced medical skills. Something didn't fit. Something was fundamentally wrong with the image everyone had of that woman, but there was no time to question, only to observe and pray. You really know what you're doing? Are you actually a doctor? Catherine asked in a trembling voice, hope and desperation battling in her words. Ms. Margaret didn't respond immediately, too focused on her task to waste energy on explanations. She had just completed another cycle of 30 compressions and was again blowing air into William's lungs, mentally visualizing the oxygen traveling through his airways, filling the alveoli, being absorbed by the blood that her compressions were forcing to circulate. When she returned to compressions, she finally responded between the numbers, her voice calm and controlled despite the intense physical effort she was making. Years of experience in emergency rooms had taught her to maintain calm even in the most chaotic situations, and that training never abandoned her, not even after years of living on the streets. She slightly adjusted the position of her hands, feeling through her experienced fingers that she had found the sweet spot, that ideal point where each compression would produce maximum circulation with minimum trauma. 5 minutes and 40 seconds since cardiac arrest. We're still within the golden window. There's still time, she said between compressions, her professional voice contrasting absurdly with her appearance. The pharmacist moved even closer, recognizing medical terminology that only professionals would use, and began timing Ms. Margaret's compressions on his watch, amazed to discover that she maintained exactly 100 to 120 compressions per minute, the ideal rhythm recommended by the latest protocols. He wanted to help, offer to take turns with her since cardiopulmonary resuscitation was extremely exhausting, but something told him it would be better not to interrupt, that those experienced hands were doing something that his couldn't reproduce. With each completed cycle, Ms. Margaret quickly checked signs that only an experienced physician would look for. Pupillary reactivity, using the reflection of sunlight, the presence of rigidity in the neck, the coloration of nails and lips, small details that informed about William's neurological and circulatory state. Her fingers found pulse points that most people didn't even know existed, checking not only the carotid but also the femoral through the fabric of his pants, feeling nuances that years of practice had taught her to interpret. Come on, I know you're in there, come back to your family, she murmured to William as she continued the compressions, her voice taking on an almost maternal tone. The crowd around had completely transformed, mockery and scorn replaced by a tense and respectful silence as everyone watched that unlikely woman fight for the life of a man she didn't even know. Some had knelt in prayer, others held their breath at each cycle of compressions, as if breathing could somehow hinder the delicate process that was taking place. The phones that had previously been filming out of morbid curiosity now captured something different, a moment of pure humanity, of competence emerging from the most unexpected place, of prejudices being shattered in real time. The security guard who had laughed at her minutes before now watched with his mouth open, his face red with shame, as he realized the monumental mistake he had made. Even the young police officer, who should have been maintaining order, was completely absorbed watching that woman's hands work with a precision he had never seen even in trained paramedics. 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, Ms. Margaret continued her relentless count, each number a battle against death. After completing another cycle, Ms. Margaret paused for a brief moment to reassess, her fingers again on William's neck, looking for any sign of return of spontaneous circulation. Her eyes, which had seemed tired and dull when begging for alms, now shone with an intensity and focus that completely transformed her face, revealing the physician that existed beneath the layers of dirt and despair. She noticed a subtle change, something that years of experience had trained her senses to detect, a slight change in skin coloration, an almost imperceptible movement of the eyelids, signs that the body was responding. Without wasting time, she returned to compressions with renewed energy, knowing that she was at the critical moment, that point where the difference between life and death would be decided. Sweat now ran abundantly down her face, leaving clean trails in the accumulated dirt, and her arms trembled from the effort. But she didn't slow the rhythm, didn't compromise the depth, didn't allow fatigue to affect the quality of the resuscitation. "Come on, William, your wife is here. She needs you. Fight," she said with more force, as if her voice could reach him wherever his consciousness might be. Suddenly, in the middle of a compression, Donna Margaret felt something change under her hands, a different resistance, a movement that wasn't caused by her. She immediately stopped and placed her fingers on William's neck, her eyes widening when she felt a weak but unmistakable pulse beating against her fingers. Without losing a second, she tilted his head to the side and watched carefully, waiting, praying until it happened. William coughed violently, his entire body contracting as his lungs desperately sucked in air like a drowning man who finally reaches the surface. The coughing continued, each one stronger than the last, expelling fluids and clearing the airways as his chest began to rise and fall on its own, irregularly at first, but gradually finding a rhythm. His eyes opened, unfocused and confused, blinking against the sunlight, not understanding where he was or what had happened, but undoubtedly alive. "My God, he's breathing! He's back!" shouted the pharmacist, tears streaming down his face. The crowd erupted in exclamations of astonishment and joy, some applauding, others crying, many kneeling in gratitude or admiration. Catherine let out a cry that was part sob, part laugh, part pure joy, and threw herself over her husband, kissing his face and repeating his name several times between tears of relief. David let the phone drop from his hand in shock, his wobbly legs making him sit heavily on the ground as he processed the miracle he had just witnessed. The young police officer was gaping, alternating his gaze between the breathing William and Donna Margaret, who was already methodically checking his vital signs as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The security guards who had humiliated her were paralyzed, their faces showing a mixture of shame, astonishment, and respect they had never felt before. Some in the crowd began to shout, "Miracle!" while others tried to get closer to touch Donna Margaret as if she was some kind of saint. "You saved him! My God, you saved him! You really are a doctor!" Catherine cried, grabbing Donna Margaret's dirty hands and kissing them repeatedly, not caring at all about the dirt. Donna Margaret gently but firmly pushed Catherine away, her attention still entirely focused on William, who was conscious but clearly disoriented and in critical condition. She checked his pupils with the sunlight, observing the response and symmetry, then checked his pulse at multiple points, counting the beats and assessing strength and regularity. Her hands moved over his chest, feeling his breathing, looking for signs of complications, murmuring medical observations that the pharmacist tried to follow, but that went beyond his basic knowledge. She noticed worrying signs. The breathing was still labored, the pulse irregular, signs that the heart had suffered significant damage and needed advanced medical intervention immediately. With the authority of someone who had commanded emergency rooms, she began giving orders that everyone around obeyed without question, the power of her competence completely obliterating her appearance as a beggar. "He needs a hospital immediately. Keep him lying down, turn slightly to the left side. Don't let him try to get up or talk too much. Someone needs to monitor his breathing constantly," she instructed, her voice clear and commanding. At that moment, the ambulance finally managed to get through the traffic and arrived at the scene, the siren dying as two paramedics jumped from the vehicle with their stretcher and equipment. They ran toward the group, expecting to find a cardiac arrest victim needing resuscitation, but instead found William conscious, breathing and with a pulse, being attended to by a woman in rags who was giving precise medical instructions about his condition. The older paramedic, a gray-haired man with decades of experience, immediately recognized the quality of care that had been provided and began working together with Donna Margaret, accepting her observations and recommendations without questioning her appearance. But it was the younger paramedic who had the most dramatic reaction. He stopped mid-step, his eyes widening in recognition as he looked beyond the dirt and rags to the face underneath. "My God! Dr. Margaret? Dr. Margaret Sullivan?" "Is that really you?" he asked, his voice trembling with emotion. Donna Margaret briefly looked up at the young paramedic, and for a moment something passed across her face. Recognition, perhaps, or memory, or pain. But she quickly looked away and shook her head, returning her attention to William. The young paramedic continued talking, his voice getting louder and more excited as the memories came back, ignoring the confused looks of everyone around who couldn't reconcile the idea of a medical professor with the homeless woman before them. He quickly told how she had been his professor 10 years ago, how she had been the best emergency medicine professor the university had ever had, how her teachings had saved countless lives through the students she had trained. But Donna Margaret was already walking away, her medical duties fulfilled now that equipped professionals had arrived, her moment of professional glory ending as abruptly as it had begun. She stood up with difficulty, her legs protesting after the intense effort, and began to slowly walk away, as if she could simply disappear back into the invisibility from which she had emerged. "Ma'am, wait. You were my professor. You taught me everything I know about emergency medicine," the paramedic pleaded, but she kept walking. The ambulance departed with sirens blaring, taking William for the treatment he needed, taking Catherine and her gratitude, taking the cameras and everyone's attention. The emergency vehicle disappeared around the corner, the sound of the siren gradually lost in the constant noise of urban traffic, and with it went all the commotion that had transformed that piece of sidewalk into a stage of human drama. Onlookers began to disperse in small groups, animatedly talking about what they had witnessed, each adding their own details and interpretations to the story they would later tell to family and friends. Some still held their cell phones, reviewing the videos they had captured, already thinking about how many views they would get on social media with that extraordinary content of a homeless woman saving a millionaire. Within minutes, the street had returned to normal, with hurried people passing by the spot where a miracle had happened without even knowing, stepping on the same ground where life and death had fought and life had won. New passers-by walked over the invisible stains of sweat and tears, never imagining that there, on that ordinary piece of concrete, a life had been snatched from the clutches of death by unlikely hands. Life goes on as if nothing happened, thought Donna Margaret as she observed the incessant flow of people. Donna Margaret finally finished collecting her few coins, each one recovered with the same meticulous care she had shown in saving William, because for her, each penny meant the difference between eating or going hungry for one more day. Her hands trembled as she put the coins in the torn pocket of her skirt, mentally counting how much she had managed to gather. It wasn't much, it never was, but it would be enough for an old loaf of bread at the bakery that sold yesterday's products at a discount. She stood up with great difficulty, leaning on the building wall while her legs violently protested against the movement, her knees audibly cracking after so long kneeling on the hard concrete performing compressions. Every muscle in her body screamed in agony, reminding her that she was no longer young, that the years on the streets had taken a high toll on her once strong and healthy physique. She walked slowly back to her usual corner, each step an agony for her exhausted body, but also familiar, comforting in a sad way that only those who have lost everything can understand. The path was short, just a few meters, but it seemed like a marathon for her trembling legs, and she had to stop twice to catch her breath. "I used to operate for 12 hours straight without getting this tired," she muttered to herself, the bitter irony in her voice. She finally reached her small territory, that piece of sidewalk that had become her unofficial home for the past 5 years, marked by her worn cardboard sign that read, "Any help, God bless," and an old blanket that someone had thrown away and she had recovered from the trash. It was pathetic, she knew, but it was hers, and there was a strange feeling of security in returning to the familiar after the intensity of what had happened. She sat heavily on her cardboard, ignoring the moisture that had accumulated on it during the morning, and leaned her sore back against the cold wall of the building that offered minimal shade against the still unforgiving sun. Her bones protested against the hardness of the concrete, but after years of sleeping on hard surfaces, she hardly noticed the discomfort anymore. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to process what had happened, reliving each second of those intense minutes when she had been a doctor again, when her skills had mattered, when she had made the difference between life and death. For a few minutes I was myself again, she thought, feeling the weight of that realization. Her hands were still shaking, no longer from physical effort, but from the adrenaline finally leaving her system, leaving behind a deep exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. It was an emotional exhaustion, the weight of having briefly touched her old life, only to see it slip between her fingers again like water. She looked at her hands, dirty, calloused, with broken nails and dry skin from years of exposure to the elements, and for a moment she could see in them the hands that once held scalpels with millimetric precision, that sutured wounds with perfect stitches, that signed prescriptions that saved lives. The emotion of having practiced medicine again, of having felt that adrenaline rush that came with the responsibility of a life in her hands, had awakened something inside her that she had tried to bury to survive the brutal reality of the streets. Tears began to form in her eyes, not from sadness but from a longing so deep that it seemed to tear her chest apart. I saved another life today, as I swore I would 40 years ago. But tomorrow I'll continue being just a beggar that people avoid with disgust, she murmured to herself, a solitary tear running down her face marked by time and leaving a clean trail in the dirt. The afternoon continued its relentless course, the sun moving slowly across the sky, while life in the city continued at its frantic pace, completely indifferent to the human drama that had unfolded there. Donna Margaret observed the people passing by, executives in their expensive suits talking on cell phones about business that seemed urgent, but probably wasn't, secretaries rushing with salads in plastic containers for quick lunches at their desks, messengers on bicycles dangerously weaving between pedestrians. None of them looked at her, their eyes trained to ignore her presence as if she were part of the urban furniture, no more notable than a trash can or a post. It was fascinating how she had returned to invisibility so quickly, as if the minutes when she had been the center of attention, the savior, the unlikely heroine, had been just a dream or hallucination. She wondered how many of those who had witnessed the miracle had already forgotten her face, remembering only the sensational story of a beggar who saved a millionaire without caring about the person behind the deed. To them I was never a person, just an exotic element in their story, she thought bitterly, but also with a resigned acceptance that came from years of being dehumanized. She adjusted her position against the wall, trying to find an angle that didn't press too much on her aching back, and picked up her dented mug, strategically positioning it where passers-by could see it if they chose to look. The few coins she had recovered clinked at the bottom, a pathetic sound that summarized her current existence. A few metal coins in an old mug, all that remained of a life that once included her own clinic, a house with a garden, a family, professional respect, purpose. The irony of having saved the life of a man who probably spent on one lunch what she needed to survive for a month did not escape her. But there was no bitterness, just a cold acknowledgement of reality. She had saved William not because he was rich or poor, not because he deserved it or not, but because she had taken an oath decades ago to preserve life, and that oath transcended her current situation, transcended social classes, transcended everything. "So a doctor is always a doctor, even when the world forgets it," she said softly, her words getting lost in the noise of the city. The hours passed slowly, the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the buildings in golden and orange hues that would be beautiful if she had the luxury of appreciating aesthetics, when her main concern was where to get drinking water and whether it would be safe to sleep in her corner that night. Some people had thrown coins in her mug throughout the afternoon, most without even looking at her, the mechanical gesture of those who donate more to ease their own conscience than out of genuine compassion. She thanked them anyway, murmuring blessings that no one stayed to hear, maintaining the dignity that was one of the few things she still possessed. As the day turned into night, she thought about William, hoping that he was well, that the hospital was taking proper care of him, that his family was by his side. She didn't expect gratitude or recognition. She had learned long ago that life didn't work like in the movies, where the kind beggar was rewarded with happy endings. "Tomorrow he won't even remember my name if he ever knew it," she thought without resentment, just with the clarity of someone who knows well how the world works. The ambulance cut through the heavy downtown traffic with its strident sirens. While inside the vehicle, paramedics worked frantically to stabilize William Harrison, who had just returned from death by the unlikely hands of a beggar woman. The older paramedic constantly monitored vital signs on the equipment, observing with concern the irregular oscillations on the cardiac monitor that indicated danger had not completely passed, while his younger colleague administered medications through the venous access they had established. Catherine was squeezed into a corner of the ambulance, her hands gripping the side rail so tightly that her fingers were white, her eyes fixed on her husband's pale face as he breathed with the help of an oxygen mask. The vehicle shook violently with each sharp turn, but the driver didn't slow down, knowing that every second counted when it came to cardiac damage of this magnitude. William opened and closed his eyes, still disoriented, trying to say something through the mask, but the paramedic gently stopped him, explaining that he needed to conserve energy. "Mr. Harrison, you suffered a severe cardiac arrest. We're taking you to the hospital. Try not to speak and breathe calmly," said the older paramedic, his voice professional but laden with urgency. Upon arrival at the hospital, a complete medical team was already waiting at the emergency entrance, alerted by radio about the severity of the case and the patient's identity. William was quickly transferred from the ambulance stretcher to the hospital gurney, with doctors and nurses running alongside him as they took him straight to the cardiac catheterization room, shouting orders and information to each other in a perfectly choreographed medical ballet. The cardiologist on duty, a middle-aged man with a serious expression, was already gowned and ready for the procedure, knowing they would likely need to clear arteries and possibly place stents to prevent another heart attack. Catherine was gently but firmly prevented from accompanying her husband beyond the double doors of the restricted area, and a nurse guided her to a private waiting room, offering water and trying to calm her while explaining they would do everything possible to save William. David arrived minutes later, his face red from running, and hugged Catherine, who finally allowed herself to completely break down, sobbing on her friend's shoulder while repeating that she couldn't lose her husband. "The best doctors in the city are taking care of him, Catherine. He'll be fine, you'll see." David tried to comfort her, although his own voice trembled with concern. Inside the catheterization room, the medical team worked with millimetric precision, inserting catheters through William's femoral artery to reach his heart and assess the damage. The cardiologist carefully observed the real-time images on the screens, identifying multiple obstructions in the coronary arteries that explained the fulminant heart attack that had almost killed him. Nurses constantly monitored vital signs, adjusting medications and keeping William sedated but conscious enough to respond to simple commands during the procedure. The anesthesiologist maintained a constant vigil over the patient's breathing and level of consciousness, ready to intervene at the slightest sign of complication. For 2 tense hours, the team worked to clear the arteries and place 3 stents, each movement calculated and precise, knowing that any mistake could be fatal. The cardiologist occasionally murmured observations to the team, noting aloud how severe the heart attack had been and how extraordinary it was that William had survived. "Whoever performed the cardiopulmonary resuscitation definitely saved this man's life. It was executed with absolute perfection," he commented while positioning the last device. During the procedure in the operating room, however, something terrible happened that sent all the doctors into panic. William had been on the table for about an hour, with the cardiologist carefully working to clear his arteries, when suddenly his heart began to beat in a completely uncontrolled manner, as if it were trembling instead of pumping blood. All the alarms in the room began to sound simultaneously, red lights flashing, while the monitors showed that William's heart had entered a deadly rhythm that doctors call fibrillation. The chief cardiologist immediately stopped what he was doing, his face turning pale behind the surgical mask, while shouting orders for his team to prepare the defibrillator. Nurses rushed back and forth preparing medications and equipment, while the doctor responsible for anesthesia frantically adjusted medications to try keeping William alive. It was a scene of controlled chaos, each person knowing exactly what to do but all aware they were losing their patient. "Prepare for electrical shock. Quick, we don't have time," shouted the cardiologist, sweat running down his forehead. The cardiologist carefully applied the defibrillator, while the team anxiously observed the patient's reaction. Without wasting time, the cardiologist ordered an increase in power and prepared to try again, while a nurse began manual cardiac massage between shocks, pressing William's chest forcefully to keep some blood circulating to the brain. The anesthesiologist injected potent medications directly into William's vein, trying to make the heart respond, while another nurse prepared more emergency medications in case they were needed. Everyone in the room knew they had only minutes before William's brain would begin to suffer permanent damage from lack of oxygen. "Let's try again. 300 joules! Stand back!" the cardiologist shouted, applying the second shock. The second shock didn't work either, and the panic in the room was now palpable, with the cardiologist shouting for more medications while they continued chest compressions. They tried a third shock, then a fourth, each time increasing the power, each time praying it would work. The medical team continued the intense effort to resuscitate William, applying the protocol with precision until his heart finally responded. But the relief lasted only a few minutes. Suddenly, William's heart stopped completely, the dreaded flat line appearing on the monitor, the continuous sound of the alarm filling the room. "He's in complete arrest. Start resuscitation immediately," shouted the cardiologist, jumping onto the table to perform chest compressions himself. For 7 agonizing minutes, the medical team fought to bring William back, alternating between cardiac massage and direct injections of adrenaline into the heart. The cardiologist made firm compressions on William's chest, fighting to keep him alive while the medical team worked urgently. The anesthesiologist desperately monitored oxygen levels in the brain, watching them fall dangerously while shouting updates to the team. Nurses rushed in bringing more medications, more equipment, anything that might help, while the cardiologist continued compressions, sweat dripping from his face onto William's open chest. Everyone in the room knew they were losing the battle, that each passing minute drastically reduced William's chances of surviving without severe brain damage. "Come on, William. Come back. Your family is waiting for you," the cardiologist muttered while continuing compressions, his arms shaking from exhaustion. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, William's heart gave a single weak beat, then another, then one more, until an irregular but present rhythm appeared on the monitor. The team continued working frantically, stabilizing him with medications, adjusting equipment, doing everything possible to maintain that precious rhythm. The cardiologist stepped down from the table, his legs wobbly from exhaustion and relief, while observing the monitors showing weak but stable vital signs. He knew William wasn't out of danger yet, that the next hours would be critical, but at least now he was alive. The team continued the procedure with extreme care, finally managing to clear the arteries and place the necessary equipment, but everyone knew it had been a very close call. "We managed to bring him back, but it was by a thread. The next few days will be crucial," the cardiologist told his team, exhaustion evident in his voice. After the procedure, William was transferred to the cardiac intensive care unit, where he would be monitored 24 hours a day for the next critical days. The ICU room was a high-tech environment, with monitors on all sides emitting constant beeps, tracking each heartbeat, each breath, each fluctuation in his vital signs. Specialized nurses took turns in shifts, checking monitors, administering medications, adjusting equipment, ensuring William received the best possible care. Catherine had been given permission to stay by his side, and she hadn't left for even a moment, holding his hand and talking softly even when he was sedated, telling him about the children, about the plans they had, about how much she loved him and needed him to get better. During the first night, William had several arrhythmias that set off the alarms, bringing the medical team running to his room, and each time Catherine felt her own heart stop with fear of losing him. "Please, my love, fight for us. Our children need their father, I need my husband," she whispered, tears falling onto the white hospital sheets. On the second day, William finally began to show consistent signs of improvement. It was then that Catherine began to tell him about the woman who had saved him, about the homeless woman who had performed the resuscitation. Upon discovering everything that had happened, the millionaire felt a gratitude he couldn't name with words, and began an investigation to find out who the homeless woman who had been a doctor might be. He started asking the hospital doctors, who were intrigued by his insistence on knowing about her, and the young paramedic who had recognized Donna Margaret was called to tell what he knew. The young man explained emotionally how she had been his teacher years ago. one of the best emergency physicians the university had ever had, and how tragically ironic it was that she had ended up on the streets. William listened to every word with intense attention, his face showing a mixture of gratitude, curiosity, and something that looked like guilt. "I need to find her. She saved my life and I don't even know her full name," William said in a hoarse voice, his determination clear despite his physical weakness. On the third day, William had been transferred to a VIP private room, still connected to monitors but out of immediate danger. The chief cardiologist came personally to explain the extent of what had happened, showing images of the blocked arteries and explaining that he had been clinically dead for almost 6 minutes. The doctor, a distinguished white-haired man with decades of experience, couldn't hide his amazement at the recovery, especially the absence of significant neurological damage after so much time without proper cerebral oxygenation. He held the MRI scans against the light, pointing to areas of the brain that should show damage, but were perfectly preserved, attributing this directly to the exceptional quality of the cardiopulmonary resuscitation that had been performed. William listened to everything carefully, but his mind kept returning to the image of those calloused, dirty hands working to save him, and the need to find his savior became increasingly urgent. "Doctor, you have to understand, this woman gave me a second chance at life. I need to thank her. I need to do something for her," William insisted, his voice gaining strength with emotion. As soon as he was discharged from the hospital that afternoon on the third day, still weak and with strict medical orders to rest, William ignored all advice and went straight to the place where he had collapsed. Catherine tried to convince him to go home, arguing that he needed to rest, that they could send someone to look for the homeless woman, but William was unyielding in his determination to look for her personally. He returned to the same stretch of sidewalk, now looking so common and mundane that it was hard to believe it had been the stage where he had almost lost his life. The corner where Donna Margaret used to stay was empty, just a piece of abandoned cardboard, indicating that someone had been there. William asked the building security guards, the same ones who had tried to prevent Donna Margaret from helping him, and they looked away embarrassed, murmuring that they hadn't seen her since that day. A nearby street vendor said she had disappeared right after the ambulance left, and no one had seen her since. "It's like she vanished into thin air, sir. 5 years here every day and suddenly gone," said the vendor, shaking his head. William expanded his search, walking through the downtown streets with an obsessive determination that worried Catherine and his doctors. He stopped at every corner where there were homeless people, showing Donna Margaret's description, asking if anyone knew her or had seen her. Most fled as soon as they saw him approaching in his expensive clothes, assuming he was police or enforcement, and the few who stopped to listen shook their heads negatively or gave vague and contradictory information. An elderly man in front of a church said he had seen a similar-looking woman heading toward the industrial district. Another swore she had taken a bus to the outlying neighborhoods, and a third claimed she had been taken away by a social services van. William noted down each clue in a small notebook, determined to follow each one, no matter how unlikely they seemed. It was then that the newsstand owner, a gentleman who had been there for decades and knew all the regulars in the area, gave the first concrete information. "Miss Margaret. Of course I know her. 5 years, every single day in the same spot. But she's been gone since the day of your incident." "I'd never seen her miss a day before," the man said, scratching his head thoughtfully. The information that her name was Margaret and the confirmation that she had disappeared right after saving him only intensified William's determination to find her. He hired a team of private detectives, the best money could buy, giving them a detailed description and offering a substantial reward for any information that might lead to her. Catherine tried to understand her husband's obsession, arguing that he should focus on his recovery, that being alive was what mattered, but William couldn't adequately explain the visceral need he felt to find that woman. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, a feeling that there was an existential debt that needed to be paid, an acknowledgement that needed to be made. He vaguely remembered bumping into her before falling, not even looking at her, treating her as an invisible obstacle in his path. "You don't understand, Catherine. I passed by her hundreds of times over 5 years and never saw her as a person. And she was the one who saved me," William explained, the guilt evident in his voice. During the following 2 weeks, William transformed his search for Ms. Margaret into his main occupation, neglecting important business and cancelling crucial meetings. He began personally visiting places where homeless people gathered, under overpasses, where the smell of urine was almost unbearable, abandoned squares where groups gathered around improvised fires, overcrowded municipal shelters where despair was palpable. Each visit was a brutal education about a reality he had ignored his entire life, each face marked by suffering a silent accusation of his previous indifference. He began to recognize faces, to learn names and stories. Earl, the former math teacher who had lost everything to gambling addiction, Maria, who had lost her children to social services after her husband abandoned her while pregnant, Pedro, the talented musician who had lost his hearing in a work accident and with it his reason to live. "Do you know Ms. Margaret? Margaret Sullivan, doctor, stays downtown, grey hair," he would ask each one, hope diminishing with each negative response. It was in a particularly degraded municipal shelter that William finally obtained more substantial information about Margaret's past. An elderly gentleman, who identified himself only as a retired professor, recognized the description and began to tell the story with a voice choked with emotion. He told how Margaret had been a brilliant doctor, graduated with distinction, who had built a respected clinic over 20 years of hard work and dedication. He told of the financial scam, an elaborate pyramid scheme that had promised extraordinary returns, and in which she had invested all her life savings, including selling her clinic, believing she could multiply her assets and help even more people. The collapse was total and devastating. In a matter of weeks, she lost everything, and her husband, already weakened by heart problems, could not withstand the shock and died of a heart attack. Her children blamed her for their father's death, for the loss of their inheritance. They left the country and cut contact. She tried to get back on her feet, but at 60 years old and in debt, no one would hire her. The street was all that remained, the gentleman recounted, tears running down his wrinkled face. William listened to the story with a heavy heart, finally understanding the magnitude of that woman's tragedy and how extraordinary it had been that she had still kept her medical oath, even after losing everything. He went to the local university, using his influence to access old records, and found Margaret Sullivan's file. Graduated with honors in 1982, specializing in cardiology, one of the best students the institution had ever had. There was a photo of her young in the file, smiling with diploma in hand, eyes shining with hope and determination, and the contrast with the beggar he had barely noticed was too painful to process. He discovered more details, articles she had published, lives she had saved, awards she had received, a brilliant career destroyed by a single error in judgment, by trusting the wrong people. William made copies of everything, determined to piece together the life of this extraordinary woman, to understand how someone could fall so low and still maintain the ability to save lives. She saved hundreds of lives in her career, and even after losing everything, she continued saving mine, he murmured, looking at the old photograph. The searches continued expanding to neighboring cities, with William showing Margaret's old photo at every shelter, every community center, every corner where homeless people gathered. Some claimed to have seen someone similar, but the leads always ended in dead ends, different people, frustrated hopes. William was beginning to understand the terrible reality of the invisibility of homeless people, how they became ghosts in broad daylight, how society had created elaborate mechanisms to not see them, not think about them, not recognize them as complete human beings with stories and values. He realized with growing shame that he himself had passed by Margaret hundreds of times over 5 years, perhaps even tossed coins in her cup without ever really looking at her, without ever seeing the brilliant doctor behind the appearance of a beggar. Guilt consumed him, not just for not seeing Margaret, but for not seeing any of them, for living in a bubble of privilege that had blinded him to human suffering right under his nose. How could I have been so blind? How can we all be so blind? He constantly wondered, the search for Margaret becoming also a journey of self-discovery. It was at the end of the second week of searching, when William was almost giving up, that a homeless man in the industrial district gave him the clue he needed. The man who took shelter in an abandoned factory said he had seen Margaret a few days ago, and she had mentioned she was tired of the noise and movement downtown, that she needed peace to think. She had asked about the old neighborhoods of the city, where there were abandoned houses and less movement, places where a person could disappear without being disturbed. The man didn't know exactly where she had gone, but was sure it was in that direction, to the forgotten side of the city where even the police rarely patrolled. William felt hope reborn in his chest, stronger than ever, and thanked the man with a generous amount of money that left him speechless. She was looking for a quieter place, boss. Said she was tired of downtown, the noise of being invisible among so many people. I think she went toward the old neighborhoods, where there are those abandoned houses that nobody cares about anymore, the homeless man said, pointing to the horizon where modern buildings gave way to decaying constructions. William drove for over an hour toward the old neighborhoods of the city, leaving behind the mirrored skyscrapers and wide avenues of the financial district to enter a part of the city that seemed to have been forgotten by progress. The streets became narrower and more potholed, modern buildings giving way to century-old houses with peeling facades and broken windows, and the frantic movement of people diminished until only a few local residents remained, who looked at him with suspicion. He had left before dawn, ignoring Catherine's protests insisting that he still needed to rest, that 3 weeks were not enough to fully recover from a heart attack, but William knew he couldn't rest until he found Margaret. His driver had insisted on accompanying him, concerned about his boss's safety in that deteriorated region, but William preferred to go alone, feeling that this was a meeting that needed to happen without intermediaries. As he advanced through the increasingly deserted streets, he checked every corner, every doorway, every shadow where someone might take shelter, hope and anxiety growing with each block. Please, let her be here. Please let me find her, he murmured to himself, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The morning was cloudy and cold, a light drizzle beginning to fall as William parked his car in front of an old church that seemed to have been abandoned for decades. The stone building was covered with moss and vines, the massive wooden doors locked with rusted chains, and the small cemetery beside it was overtaken by tall weeds growing between the broken tombstones. He got out of the car and looked around, noticing how that part of the city seemed to exist in a different dimension, where time had stopped at some point in the last century and never started moving again. Abandoned houses lined the street, with collapsed roofs and walls covered in faded graffiti, and vacant lots alternated with buildings in ruins where nature had begun to reclaim its space. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of barking dogs and the cooing of pigeons that had made nests in the abandoned structures. William began to walk slowly down the street, his expensive shoes making noise on the loose gravel, looking for any sign of human life in that desolate scenario. "Margaret? Ms. Margaret, are you here?" he called, his voice echoing strangely among the empty buildings. It was when he rounded the side of the church that he finally saw her, and his heart almost stopped again, this time from pure emotion. "Ms." Margaret was sitting on the back steps of the church, where a small side door still seemed to be used occasionally, perhaps by the priest who came once a week to check on the place. She was hunched over, throwing breadcrumbs to a group of pigeons that pecked eagerly around her feet, and seemed to be talking quietly to the birds as if they were old friends. Her face was thinner than William remembered, her cheekbones more prominent, but there was a serenity in her expression that wasn't there before, as if she had found some peace in that forgotten place. She wore the same tattered clothes, perhaps even more worn now, and beside her was a small bundle with what appeared to be her only belongings. William paused for a moment, observing her, feeling the weight of the moment, knowing he was about to change 2 lives, hers and his own. "Miss Margaret," he finally called, starting to run toward her. Margaret slowly raised her head upon hearing her name, her eyes focusing on the well-dressed man running toward her, and for a moment there was confusion on her face before recognition appeared. She didn't stand up, didn't run away, just calmly watched as William almost stumbled in his hurry to reach her, his shoes slipping on the stones, dampened by the drizzle. When he finally arrived, breathless and with his face red from the effort, she tilted her head slightly and a small smile appeared on her chapped lips. Her hands continued throwing the last crumbs to the pigeons, which now looked suspiciously at the intruder who had disturbed their breakfast. Her calmness completely contrasted with his agitation, as if she had been waiting for this moment, or perhaps as if she had already accepted that it would never come, and was now just mildly surprised to be wrong. "You survived." "That's good," she said in a soft, almost maternal voice, as if she were commenting on the weather. William fell to his knees before her, completely ignoring the dirt and dampness of the steps that immediately stained his expensive suit, his hands trembling as he struggled to find the words he had rehearsed 1,000 times in his mind. He could feel tears forming in his eyes as he looked at the face marked by time and suffering of the woman who had given him a second chance in life, and all the emotion of the past 3 weeks, the fear of death, gratitude for survival, guilt for his past indifference, determination to find her, came to the surface at once. His knees ached against the cold, wet stone, but he hardly noticed, focused only on Margaret's serene face that watched him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The pigeons had moved away a little, but still pecked at the crumbs around, creating a surreal scene of a millionaire kneeling before a beggar, while urban birds continued their morning meal, indifferent to the human drama. "You saved my life. I've been looking everywhere," he managed to say, his voice choked with emotion. Margaret gently shook her head, her eyes showing a compassion that came from decades of caring for people, of understanding the weight of gratitude and emotional debt that saved patients carried. She had seen this many times in her career, people who felt they owed their lives to her, who needed to express a gratitude that sometimes became a burden for both. Her hands, the same ones that had performed the perfect resuscitation, now rested calmly in her lap, and she took a deep breath before responding, choosing her words carefully. There was something of unshakable dignity in her, even dressed in rags, even after years on the streets, an inner strength that no amount of suffering had managed to break. She looked at William kneeling before her and saw not the powerful millionaire, but a man struggling with mortality, with gratitude, with guilt, and her doctor's heart responded as it always had, with compassion. "You didn't need to seek me out, Mr. Harrison. I did what any doctor would do. What I swore to do 40 years ago when I graduated," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of decades of dedication. William shook his head vigorously, disagreeing, his hands gesturing as he tried to make her understand the magnitude of what she had done. He remembered the security guard's laughter, everyone's disbelief, how she had been humiliated and yet didn't give up, pushing everyone aside to save someone who hadn't even treated her as a human being minutes before. The image of her being ridiculed while insisting she was a doctor, being pushed away and prevented from helping, and still persevering, had haunted him since he woke up in the hospital. He had relived that moment hundreds of times, each time feeling more ashamed of his own blindness, of how he had lived in a world where people like Margaret were invisible, disposable, less than human. Tears now flowed freely down his face, and he made no effort to wipe them away, letting her see his vulnerability, his humanity, everything that money and power had masked for so long. "No, you did much more. My wife told me everything that happened the day I fell ill. When everyone gave up on me, when they laughed at you, when they humiliated you, you didn't give up. I need to repay you, I need to help you," he insisted, his voice gaining strength with conviction. Margaret smiled sadly, a smile that carried 5 years of abandonment, of invisibility, of survival without hope of salvation. She had learned long ago that charity, especially that which came from guilt, was temporary and often more painful than indifference. How many times had someone promised to help her, only to disappear when the novelty wore off, when conscience was eased, when life returned to normal? She had built walls around her heart to survive, had learned to expect nothing from anyone, to not depend on empty promises or grand gestures that evaporated with the daylight. Her survival depended on having no hopes, accepting each day as it came, not dreaming of redemption or salvation. She looked at William, saw the sincerity in his eyes, but also saw the familiar pattern, the savior wanting to save, the debtor wanting to pay, the guilty wanting absolution. "I don't need charity, Mr. Harrison. I survived 5 years without it. I will continue to survive," she said, her voice gentle but firm. But William wasn't willing to accept that answer, not after all he had learned about her in recent weeks. He began to tell about his obsessive search, about every person he had spoken to, every place he had visited, every piece of information he had gathered about her extraordinary life. He told about his visit to the university, about seeing her young photo with her diploma, about discovering the articles she had published, the lives she had saved, the awards she had received. He talked about the man at the shelter who had told her story with tears in his eyes, about how he had discovered the financial scam, about her husband's death, about the children who abandoned her. Each word was spoken with respect and admiration, not pity, and Margaret listened in silence, her eyes filling with tears as she heard her life being told back to her by a stranger who had taken the trouble to piece it together. "You are not just a beggar. You are a brilliant doctor, a lifesaver. You cannot continue on the streets. I cannot allow it," William said passionately, his voice echoing between the walls of the abandoned church. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, the memories she had buried to survive coming back with full force. She could see herself young again, full of dreams and ideals, believing she could make a difference in the world. She could feel the weight of the stethoscope around her neck, the smell of disinfectant in the hospital corridors, the adrenaline of saving a life, the sadness of losing a patient. She remembered her husband, how they had built the clinic together, working nights and weekends, sacrificing everything for the dream of caring for people. She remembered her children when they were little, playing in the waiting room while she saw patients, proud to have a doctor for a mother. And then she remembered how everything had collapsed, the greed of wanting more in order to help more people, trust in the wrong friend, the downward spiral that took her from respected doctor to invisible beggar. A tear ran down her face, leaving a clean trail in the dirt. "Why would you do this for me? Why do you care?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. William took a deep breath, searching for the right words to express what he felt, the transformation he had gone through since that day on the sidewalk. He thought about all the times he had walked past her without seeing her, how he had built his fortune ignoring the suffering around him, how he had lived in a bubble of privilege that had blinded him to the humanity of people like Margaret. He thought about how she had seen him not as a millionaire or a stranger, but as a human being in need of help, and how this simple change in perspective had saved his life. He realized it wasn't just about paying a debt or alleviating his guilt. It was about recognizing the humanity he had ignored for so long, about breaking the invisible barriers that separated people like him from people like her. "Because when I was dying, you saw a human being who needed help. Not a millionaire, not a stranger, just someone who needed to live. Let me see you the same way," he said honestly, his voice laden with genuine emotion. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the cooing of pigeons and the soft sound of drizzle falling on the broken tiles. Margaret studied him carefully, looking for signs of falsehood, of empty promises, of performative charity, but found only sincerity and determination. She had developed a sixth sense for detecting people's true intentions after years on the streets, and something about William seemed genuinely transformed. He wasn't the same arrogant man who had bumped into her without apologizing. This was someone who had faced death and returned with a different perspective. She sighed deeply, feeling the walls she had built beginning to crack, the hope she had buried trying to resurface despite her best efforts to keep it dead. Still, the fear of being disappointed again, of allowing herself to dream only to be abandoned once more, made her hesitate. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've become in these years on the streets," she said, testing his determination. William adjusted himself on his knees, ignoring the growing pain, and began to talk about everything he had learned and observed in the past few weeks. He talked about how he had begun to see homeless people as people with stories, not as problems to be avoided. He told her about Earl, the teacher, Maria, who lost her children, Pedro, the deaf musician, and how each had a story of loss and abandonment that society chose to ignore. He admitted his own blindness, his past indifference, how he had built his fortune without ever thinking about using his power to make a real difference in people's lives. He spoke about how the experience of nearly dying and being saved by her had fundamentally changed how he saw the world, how he could no longer go back to his previous life pretending that people like her didn't exist. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, conviction growing with each word. "I know that you are Dr. Margaret Sullivan, graduated with honors, cardiology specialist, who saved hundreds of lives. But more importantly, I know that you are someone who, even after losing everything, maintained your humanity, your oath, your compassion," he said with genuine admiration. Margaret's defenses finally began to completely give way, and she allowed herself to really look at William, not as the millionaire he was, but as the patient she had saved, the man who was genuinely trying to give back, not out of obligation, but out of true recognition. She began to speak, slowly at first, then more fluidly, telling her complete story for the first time in years. She told about the clinic she had built with her husband, how she treated underprivileged patients for free on Wednesdays, how she had mortgaged the house to buy better equipment. She talked about the childhood friend who showed up with an investment opportunity that seemed solid, promising returns that would allow them to expand the clinic, serve more people. She told how she had sold everything, the clinic, the house, the car, and invested every penny believing she was doing the right thing. Margaret continued, telling about her desperate attempts to get back on her feet, about how she had looked for work at every hospital and clinic in the city, but nobody wanted to hire a 60-year-old doctor who was in debt and without recent references. She told about her first nights on the street, sleeping in public bathrooms, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity while her world collapsed. She spoke about the day she accepted that she was homeless, when she stopped pretending it was temporary, when she began to beg because it was that or starve to death. Every word was a wound being reopened, but also a catharsis, years of pain and humiliation finally being expressed to someone who was truly listening. William listened in silence, tears running down his face, feeling the weight of each word, of each moment of suffering that could have been avoided if society were less cruel. I tried to work in public hospitals, community clinics, anywhere. But without a fixed address, without proper clothes, who would hire a homeless woman claiming to be a doctor? She asked bitterly. William took a deep breath and stood up, his knees protesting after so long on the hard floor, and extended his hand to Margaret. He had made his decision even before finding her, but now, after hearing her story, his determination was absolute. He wasn't offering charity or handouts. He was offering justice, a chance to correct at least a small part of what was wrong in the world. His company employed thousands of people, and he had realized in recent weeks that there was no real medical support for them beyond the basic health insurance. How many of his employees were suffering in silence, without access to quality medical care, without someone who saw them as people and not just numbers on a spreadsheet? Dr. Sullivan, I'd like to offer you a position, not charity, a real job. My company needs a doctor to take care of the employees, someone with experience, compassion, who understands that behind each worker there's a person with family, dreams, fears, he said formally, his hand still extended. Margaret looked at the extended hand for a long moment, seeing in it not just a job offer, but a bridge back to the life she had lost. But fear was still there, whispering doubts in her ear. 5 years on the streets had changed more than her appearance. They had changed her confidence in herself, in her ability to return to who she was. She looked at her own hands, dirty and calloused, broken nails, dry skin, and tried to imagine these hands holding a stethoscope again, examining patients, signing prescriptions. The distance between who she was now and who she needed to be seemed insurmountable. Moreover, there were practical issues that seemed like overwhelming barriers. I no longer have an active medical license. I don't have proper clothes. I don't even have documents. They were stolen years ago. How could I work like this? She asked, her voice trembling between hope and fear. William smiled for the first time since he had arrived, a genuine smile that lit up his face, still pale from recovery. He had anticipated these objections and had already taken steps, using his influence and resources to remove each obstacle that might prevent Margaret from accepting his offer. He had consulted lawyers, had spoken with the medical board, had prepared everything so she could simply say yes and begin a new life. But he understood that it wasn't just the practical barriers that made her hesitate. It was the fear of dreaming again, of allowing herself hope after years of hopelessness. He knelt again, this time gently taking her hands in his, ignoring the dirt, feeling only the hands that had saved his life. All of this can be resolved. I have lawyers who can recover your documents. I can pay for the renewal of your medical license, and clothes are the least of our problems. The question is, do you accept? Do you want to be a doctor again? He asked softly. Margaret looked into his eyes and saw something she hadn't seen in years. Someone who believed in her, who saw her for what she was and not for what she had become. Tears fell freely now, washing away years of pain and resignation, and she felt something awaken inside her that she had thought was dead forever. Hope. But there was still one last doubt, one last fear she needed to express. It was the voice of 5 years of abandonment, of broken promises, of destroyed dreams that needed to be heard. She squeezed his hands, feeling the human warmth that had been denied to her for so long, and asked the question she feared most. What if I don't adapt? If 5 years on the streets have changed me too much? If I can't go back to being the doctor I was? She asked, her voice almost inaudible. William squeezed her hands more firmly, conveying through touch all the conviction he felt. He thought about his own journey back from death, about how each day was a struggle to get back to normal, about how sometimes he felt like a different person inhabiting his old life. If he could recover from having died for 6 minutes, surely Margaret could recover from 5 years on the streets. Besides, he wasn't just offering a job, he was offering support, patience, the time and resources necessary for her to rebuild herself. He had learned that sometimes all someone needs is a chance, someone who believes when not even the person believes anymore. So we'll try something else, we'll adapt, we'll find a way, but we won't give up. You didn't give up on me when everyone thought it was too late. I won't give up on you now, not in a month, not in a year. We're in this together, he responded with absolute firmness. The moment stretched between them, loaded with meaning, with possibility, with mutual redemption. Margaret looked around, at the abandoned church that had been her shelter, at the pigeons that had been her only company, at the beggar's life that had been her reality for 5 years, and then looked at William, at the hand still extended, at the future he was offering. It was terrifying to leave behind the known, even if the known was suffering, to embrace the unknown. But something inside her, perhaps the same strength that had made her push away security guards to save a man who had ignored her, made her make the decision. She accepted with a nod, unable to speak through tears that were now of relief, of gratitude, of a joy she had forgotten she could feel. William gently pulled her to her feet and hugged her, ignoring the smell, the dirt, everything, except the fact that he was embracing the woman who had saved his life, and who now he would have the chance to save hers. They stood there embracing for a long moment, two unlikely survivors finding salvation in each other, while the drizzle continued to fall softly around them. When they finally separated, Margaret held William's hands and said the words that perfectly summarized both their journeys. Her voice was hoarse with emotion, but there was a strength in it that wasn't there before, as if accepting help had somehow restored part of who she was. The pigeons had returned to peck at the crumbs around their feet, and the sun was trying to break through the clouds, creating a moment of unexpected beauty in that forgotten place. You know what the irony is? I saved hundreds of lives in my career, always believed it was my purpose. But saving yours, may have saved mine too, she said, a small smile appearing on her lips for the first time in years. Months later, the morning sun came through the window of Margaret Sullivan's apartment as she prepared for another day of work at the Harrison Enterprises Medical Clinic. 6 months had passed since that dramatic day when William Harrison nearly died on a sidewalk in the financial district, and she, a beggar at the time, saved him with a perfect cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Now wearing clean, professional clothes, with well-groomed hair tied in an elegant bun, it was hard to believe that this was the same woman who had spent 5 years living on the streets. The apartment, though modest, was comfortable and dignified. It had a spacious living room, 2 bedrooms, a well-equipped kitchen, and most importantly, it was hers, a true home after years of homelessness. Margaret had fully recovered her medical career. With the help of William and his team of lawyers, all her documents were recovered and reissued. Her medical license was renewed after a process that included refresher courses and exams that she passed with distinction, proving that years on the streets had not diminished her medical knowledge. The clinic she now ran at William's company was state-of-the-art, equipped with modern technology and a dedicated team of nurses and assistants. She served not only the company's 3,000 employees, but had implemented a special program where 3 times a week, the clinic opened its doors to homeless people in the area, offering free and dignified medical care. Margaret's physical transformation had been remarkable. Proper nutrition, regular medical care, and the dignity of having a home and a purpose had rejuvenated her appearance by years. Her hands, once calloused and dirty, were now well cared for, capable of performing delicate medical procedures with the same precision as always. She had gained healthy weight, her skin had regained its glow, and her eyes shone with a vitality that had been absent during the dark years on the streets. More importantly, she had regained her professional confidence, that certainty that comes from knowing you are competent at what you do and that your work has value. William, in turn, had fully recovered from the heart attack. Under Margaret's attentive care, he had adopted a completely different lifestyle. He lost 15 kilos, began exercising regularly, changed his diet to a healthier one, and, most importantly, learned to balance work and personal life. The regular medical examinations showed that his heart had recovered remarkably well, with no significant sequelae from the event that nearly took his life. He took preventive medications religiously and followed all of Margaret's recommendations with a dedication that surprised even his wife, Catherine. But the change in William went far beyond physical health. The near-death experience and his encounter with Margaret had fundamentally transformed his worldview and priorities. The company, which was previously managed with an exclusive focus on profits and results, now had robust social responsibility programs. Beyond the complete medical clinic, there were psychological support programs for employees, educational assistance for their children, and an emergency fund for employees in financial difficulties. William had discovered that well-cared-for employees were not only more productive, but that there was personal satisfaction in knowing he was making a real difference in people's lives. The relationship between Margaret and William had evolved into a deep friendship based on mutual respect and gratitude. They met regularly, not just for medical consultations, but to discuss the social projects they had created together. The Second Chances Foundation, created by William with Margaret as the main medical consultant, had already taken dozens of professionals off the streets. Nurses, teachers, engineers, people who, like Margaret, had lost everything, but still had much to offer, received not only emergency help, but complete support to rebuild their lives. Margaret had also rebuilt ties with her family. Her children, who had cut contact after their father's death and the loss of all family assets, were initially shocked to discover she was alive and well. The reconciliation process had been slow and painful, with many difficult conversations about guilt, forgiveness, and regret. But gradually, family love prevailed. Her children now visited her regularly, bringing the grandchildren she was meeting for the first time. Seeing their mother recovered, working again as a doctor, living with dignity, had healed wounds that seemed permanent. Professionally, Margaret had become a reference in corporate social medicine. She had published articles on the importance of humanized care in the workplace, on how employee health directly impacts the productivity and general well-being of the company. Other corporations began to seek her out for consulting, wanting to replicate the successful model she had created at Harrison Enterprises. Universities invited her to lectures, where she spoke not only about medicine, but about resilience, about second chances, about the importance of seeing the human being behind each patient. The clinic under her management had become a model of excellence. With a team of 2 assistant physicians, 5 nurses, and 3 aides, it served an average of 100 patients a day. The prevention programs Margaret had implemented were already showing results. A 40% reduction in sick leave, early diagnoses of conditions that could have become severe, and a measurable increase in employee satisfaction with the company. The homeless care program had served more than 500 people, some of whom managed to get off the streets with the foundation's help. William had become a man passionate about social causes, using his influence and resources to promote systemic changes. He frequently spoke at business events about his experience, about how nearly dying had opened his eyes to what really matters in life. The story of how a homeless woman had saved his life and how he had repaid by saving hers had become legendary in the business world, inspiring other entrepreneurs to look beyond profits. Financially, Margaret was secure for the first time in years. Besides the generous salary as medical director of the clinic, she received payment for consultations and lectures. She had paid off the old debts that still hung from before her fall and even started a small savings account. But more important than money was the emotional security of knowing she would never be vulnerable in that way again, that she had a support network, stable work, a home. The impact of the encounter between Margaret and William continued to spread. Company employees who had been treated by Margaret frequently commented on how she treated them with rare compassion and attention, as if each person was unique and important. Some had been inspired to do volunteer work with homeless people. Others had changed the way they viewed people in vulnerable situations. The company culture had fundamentally changed, becoming more human, more compassionate. Margaret occasionally passed by the place where she had lived for 5 years, that corner on the sidewalk of the financial district. Sometimes she left food or money for whoever had taken her place, always with a word of encouragement. She would never forget those years, not because she wanted to torture herself, but because they had become an integral part of who she was, had taught her about resilience, about the fragility of life, about what really matters. On a sunny afternoon, 6 months after her rescue, Margaret and William were sitting in the garden of the clinic they had created together, drinking coffee and reviewing plans to expand the mobile care program. Around them, corporate life continued its frantic pace, but they had learned the importance of moments of pause and reflection. "We saved each other," Margaret said simply, and William agreed. There was no need for more words. Two lives that should never have crossed paths in that way had intertwined in a story of mutual redemption that would continue to impact hundreds of other lives. The millionaire and the beggar had become the doctor and the doctor, two human beings who had learned that true wealth lies in the ability to make a difference in the lives of others. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the mutual understanding of people who had seen the worst and best of humanity. William thought about how he had spent decades accumulating fortune, building a business empire, believing that success was measured in numbers in bank accounts and size of assets. Now, sitting beside Margaret, he understood that his greatest wealth was having been saved by someone society had discarded and having had the opportunity to give back. Margaret, in turn, had learned that accepting help wasn't weakness, that allowing others to save her was as important as saving others. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and Margaret, and they remained there, two unlikely survivors who had found purpose in each other. The journey back had been difficult for both, William learning to live with the fragility of life, Margaret learning to trust in human kindness again. But together, they had built something greater than the sum of their individual parts, a legacy of compassion that would continue long after both were gone, touching lives they would never know, creating waves of change that would spread for generations. Now tell me in the comments where you're from and tell me, did you like this story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and check out the next one that's waiting for you here on screen. I'll wait for you there.